We're going on a spiritual journey today.
Oh yeah.
In our wellness eras today.
Blink 3 times when you feel it kicking in. That's solar power.
Exactly.
What's our topic today? I don't know. What's our topic?
We're trying to riff with the audience right now. So the pop girlies are in their wellness era. What is a pop girlies wellness era?
I think we should all give our own definitions, but to me, the wellness album, it's usually an album after a period of darkness, an album that's more focused on reflection and somewhat positive vibes. I don't think it's super focused on like being a positive album, but something that's kind of like a reflection that a dark time has passed.
I agree that the albums come after a dark time, but I also think that they tend to come after an artist's, I don't want to say biggest album, but like a really busy time for them. They were very much in the spotlight, getting critical acclaim, audience attention, and it's kind of like a detox from that. They're relaxing from being worked to the point of exhaustion, basically. And I think they usually thematically have to do with spirituality or like existentialism, and the visuals usually pertain to nature. And sonically, they are kind of acoustic or folky sounding, maybe a little lo-fi.
Going off of that, it's like a divergence from that initial fame era that they may have experienced that came with a sort of expectation of partying and like everything is fun, everything's a good time. And now they're looking to sort of wind down and look inward. And I think the lyricism and the aesthetics as well leans heavily into that sort of like being subdued and a little more calm and maybe taking like a step back from fame and everything that's expected of it. They're essentially cosplaying as hippies, but it's like wearing less makeup, the sort of no makeup thing, going for a more natural vibe, natural, relaxed hair, nothing crazy. Same with the clothing, very like neutral, toned down, like skirts and dresses. Again, like just picturing like being in nature and not getting dressed up, not performing for anyone, as if they're showing us their real selves as opposed to like dressing up for their persona.
A big characteristic of these wellness albums is that they're usually more of like a cult classic album. They're usually not very well received critically or by audiences. Not that they're like bad albums or did poorly, like they were still successful, but not as successful as an artist's prior works, and definitely receive, I guess, like flop era treatment on social media. And now it seems like this is becoming a trend. Like there's a lot of pop girlies that are kind of leaning into this wellness era of their careers, and those seem to be getting well received. So it's kind of an examination of why now is a good time for that and why people are looking back at these kind of cult classic wellness albums and changing their minds about their initial opinions.
One of the first things that came to mind for me was the question of like, okay, well then if everyone is accepting wellness era, then does that mean that like the whole hedonistic party culture is that dead now? When we did like the Indie Sleaze episode talking about how like everyone wants to go back in time to those like significant party eras of the past, the wellness era is so the antithesis to that and sort of like what you resort to after that party era. So I don't know. I feel like all these different mindsets, I guess, are existing at the same time. And it makes for some really interesting opposites coming out with music right now.
I agree. Monoculture is definitely dying out. There are just so many different subcultures of the internet that you can fall into. So solar power is kind of the mother of these albums. Lorde wasn't the first to make an album like this, but she's probably the first to make an album so obviously centered on wellness, to the point where the song Mood Ring is literally a satirical song about wellness culture and engaging in spirituality, because these healing and wellness aesthetics and trends are usually heavily perpetuated and glamorized by white women, and the song kind of plays on that idea. Aside from the self-awareness of this album, it's also very self-referential. The most obvious being the song Secrets from a Girl Who's Seen It All, being her literally talking to her younger self. And in the music video for that song, there are 3 different versions of her, each one representative of her 3 albums. But then there are songs that are a little more subtle in their reference, such as Stoned at the Nail Salon being a continuation or response to her song Ribs off of Pure Heroin, or the song Oceanic Feeling, where she has the line, "Now the cherry black lipstick's gathering dust in a drawer, I don't need her anymore," referring to how she used to wear dark lipstick and dark clothing to feel empowered. And I think that some of this went over people's heads, which resulted in the album getting misunderstood. And I actually went back to find articles that were put out when Solar Power was released back in 2021. And there's a Variety article written by Chris Willman. Willman writes, Lorde sent a jolt through her fandom, who had reasonable expectations that she might pick up at least a little where she left off, looking, if not sounding, a little goth. Lorde had established herself in a sort of signature synth sound with maybe some cynical lyricism and darker imagery that people really resonated with. And so for her to come back with a more acoustic guitar sounding album that's very colorful and yellow and revolving around nature was surprising for a lot of people. But I've seen a lot of chatter online about people changing their tune about solar power and going back and listening to it and understanding it better. And part of that is maybe because summer is coming, so people are more in tune with positive music that has to do very much with nature. And she dropped the album at the end of August in 2021. So for us in the Northern Hemisphere, that was the end of our summer that that album was released. But because Lorde is from New Zealand, in the Southern Hemisphere, winter was ending and it was going into spring. So I kind of wonder if the album was released at a different time of the year, if it would have had a different reception. So maybe the time that the album gets released impacts how people interact with it. Another article that was posted in 2022, a year after Solar Power was released. This was on Nina Raymont's Substack. This person did not really engage that much with Solar Power on their first couple listens when the album first came out, and they went back and listened to it at the beach. And they say, as the waves crashed to the shore, as the beach bums around me kicked a soccer ball from one person to another, as I sipped on my Trader Joe's hard kombucha and listened to Solar Power for the first time since last September, I thought to myself, this is where I should have been listening to this album all along. On the beach, I felt happy. The album sounded good. So I think this was just kind of one of those albums where you had to be really immersed in it, and the setting and the time at which you listened to it mattered. And I think that that contributed to the album getting, unfortunately, so misunderstood.
I consider Lorde in this conversation as sort of the wellness album trailblazer.
Yeah.
Lorde's audience, like, it had been a drought in terms of like content and music. So I think when she had announced that she was coming out with a new album, they were really thinking of more music similar to that melodrama high that they were craving. It's not melodrama, so they're a little bit disappointed with the new sound that she was going with, especially after, so long of not coming out with a full album. And I always thought that wasn't fair, given that the demand for constant access to like art from your favorite artist is just so exhausting to me. And that always frustrated me when I would see like communities online always demand new music. There has to be some sort of boundary created between you and the artist, especially in a capitalistic society. Like, we have to kind of create that boundary where they need to create art when they see fit. And also with Eternal Sunshine, too. I think a lot of people, I mean, I saw a lot of people online kind of be disappointed with this album from Ariana, especially since it had kind of been a similar situation where it had been a while since she created music. But a lot of people also kind of embraced that, like, this definitely was something that she was proud of and was kind of different than what she usually writes. And because of that, they liked the album. I think it's been predominantly well received. She's always been like not afraid to talk about kind of uncomfortable feelings or like uncomfortable situations. But I think her wellness is just her being like true to herself and honoring her songwriting. But also, she's also a very spiritual person too. I think people don't maybe realize. Also, I mean, like, she's in hot water right now because of her dating situation. So I don't think people understand it.
I think in a way it is a little sonically different just because I'm thinking like
Yeah.
Eternal Sunshine, like the song has that, it sounds like a lo-fi beat
Hmm.
and then also just like spirituality, but then I feel like that's harder to ignore on an album like this. That's literally called Eternal Sunshine, and there's kind of like celestial imagery in that, and that's obviously like very tied to like astrology and that kind of spirituality there.
That's part of her spirituality too, is she's really into astrology.
Also, another big part of the wellness album is the artist talking to their younger self in a way. The Eternal Sunshine album cover, Ariana Grande is literally supporting herself. Like she has her head on her own shoulder because there's two of her on the album cover. So definitely the reference to kind of growth and healing and who you've become and being able to self-soothe, I guess, is like thematically a really big part of the wellness albums.
Yeah.
The need to like lessen the demand from artists to put out any sort of content, whether it be a body of work or just like having constant access to them as people. And that's like a loaded conversation that could fit into its own episode. But I think, especially when talking about this so-called wellness era that a lot of pop singers enter, I feel like that is the default for when pop artists want to separate themselves from that demand, like a literal and metaphorical like retreat from the constant like fame and attention and not caring what people think about it and just putting something out because it's something that they feel strongly about and genuinely believe in.
And then also running parallel to that is this pop girly turn to country. We've seen with Beyonce and soon to be Lana Del Rey, which has me wondering like, are we gradually gonna keep moving further and further into country, that country is gonna become the new like mainstream charting songs that end up on the radio rather than traditional like dance pop music?
That's interesting. Because I did have a sort of thesis about this also, because our generation is aging, and a common sentiment, especially with Gen Z, that country music sucks and you want to stay as far away from it as possible. Like that sort of attitude in our generation was so prevalent. But I think there's like a parallel trend, I think, of like this line is us aging and getting older and maturity levels maybe getting better. And then this is, oh, country music is okay. Not that like Lana Del Rey or Beyonce are relying on us to like mature to realize that there's a lot of good country music, but that sort of pivot to those genres is gonna excel really well because our attitudes are changing in terms of music. And I think with wellness albums, like that was kind of a proof of concept for the flexibility that these pop artists have with genres in general. So I think there's just kind of a good creative reckoning at this time for people to just be like, yeah, like we're gonna do it because we want to do it and because we personally like it rather than what maybe our audience likes.
Going off what we were saying about country possibly being the new mainstream, I personally think a lot of it has to do with pop singers wanting to go back to the singer-songwriter era of the 60s and 70s, which leaned heavily into folk music with the likes of Joni Mitchell, Carole King, Joan Baez, a little bit of Linda Ronstadt too. Obviously, they were pivotal in not only the so-called like singer-songwriter genre, if you will, but just for women in popular music altogether. And I think the wellness eras that these musicians are entering owe a lot of credit to those musicians in that time period, not just aesthetically, but also in the way that it sounds and this idea of like wanting to write your own songs and taking like a more simplistic approach to your instruments and your musicianship and things like that. And obviously today there's a super heavy emphasis on nostalgia, even in music. Like we're seeing people wanting to replicate different eras, different aesthetics, and what have you. I found this thesis that someone wrote on these women in this era. It's from Christine Kelly from Fordham University. So thanks, Christine. It's really well written. It's called Singing Out Between Tradition and Rebellion. And in the introduction, this person opens with referencing this Time article that was written on Joan Baez that I thought was really, really interesting because she quotes heavily from this author that wrote the piece. And the way that he writes about Joan Baez is so similar to the way that we still talk about women in music today. Just like such a heavy emphasis on the way that she looks and how it's a complete divergence from the pop singers of the time. He says that she's like morosely feminine, which I loved actually. So kudos to him for that one part. And he says that she's out of place in light of usual expectations of glamour and charm for young female entertainers. And he notes how she doesn't wear makeup. Her outfits are very conservative, and there was like little sex to be found of her compared to other artists, which I was like, gross. And then these singer-songwriters existed as feminists of their time, but they didn't necessarily claim that term, which I thought was really interesting. Nor did they attempt to or were given like a place within that feminist movement of like the second wave movement of that time period. And so instead they occupied like a middle ground between like traditional feminism and rebelling against feminism, which I think we can kind of see today too, especially with feminism being like so in limbo. I'm trying to say that there are parallels between the movement of feminism that we experienced and the one from back then. And consciously or not, the music is obviously going to reflect that. Even us just talking about this topic, the way that pop musicians are perceived, like it's inherently going to be perceived within a feminist lens, them being female musicians.
I think also to further push that agenda, Joni Mitchell literally performed at the Grammys this past year.
Yes, she was so good.
I know. And apparently they're making a Linda Ronstadt biopic.
With Selena Gomez, yes.
The wellness era is here.
This just came to mind, but the other day we were talking about the niche memes on the internet, sort of similar to like the girl bloggers and the way that they post and the different like musicians and like objects and aesthetics that they latch onto. And I feel like that brand, if you will, of internet person has like latched on to the likes of Joni Mitchell and Joan Baez and Linda. The Joni Mitchell fangirls crack me up. I don't know if you guys have seen like Joni Mitchell memes online. It's just so funny. Like obviously many people were upset when Joni first removed her music off Spotify. The Gen Z girlies. It was so funny. Just like they were so distraught by the fact that Joni was not on Spotify. Like I feel like she's like the queen mother of all the girl bloggers.
I almost wonder if that is because of the rise of Phoebe Bridgers and Boy Genius. That brand of fan is likely to like Elliott Smith or like Jeff Buckley, and I feel like the folk girlies of the 60s and 70s would fit into that.
There's a specific brand of sad Gen Z person that
Yeah.
has sort of dominated the soft rock renaissance, if you will. And excuse me, I forgot to mention the one and only Stevie Nicks,
Oh,
Mm.
so
because you
true.
can't talk about women in music without talking about Stevie.
And Silver Springs going viral this past summer. There's something
Yes.
about like a woman scorned that people just really resonate with.
No, so true. So true. And I feel like every popular music artist loves Stevie, especially the singer-songwriter girlies, of course.
We could also go down a whole other pipeline of just her kind of being a spirituality influencer like icon to people too. But then like she's also like a Twilight girly, like literally wrote a whole album like based on Twilight and like talks about that.
Yeah.
And that's been like memeified like online and stuff like that. And people are like, she's so real for that. Like she really is just one of the girls. So I think there's just like a sense of relatability to her in like a weird way.
No, that's so real. Relatability is the perfect word. And I think that's what all the pop girlies trying to enter their wellness eras are looking for, is that sense of connection that these older female artists had with their fans and even with their music because of the like deeply personal nature of their songwriting. That's what they want as opposed to manufactured pop music. Do we want to talk about Kacey?
Let's talk about Kacey.
I actually found an article about this by Chris Richards. The article starts off with saying, feel free to wince a little upon hearing that Kacey Musgraves is now singing about the holistic benefits of moonbathing in jade bracelets. But please know that unlike other recent pop albums that dabble in the wellness woo-woo, Lorde Solar Power, FKA Twigs' Capri Songs, the singer's new record, Deeper Well, totally gets away with it. Why? Because Musgraves is a country singer who ultimately believes in Willie Nelson more than astrology, tarot, or goop. She knows the greatest country songs ever written aim to provide tidy answers to the thorniest questions of existence. Lucky for those of us who think of wellness lifestyles as spiritual make-believe for people with money, those are still the kinds of songs Musgraves wants to write. And I was like, damn, not him taking the other pop girlies down for this. Like, that's like so crazy. And like Goopcore is like actually really funny, I think.
That is
Yeah.
funny.
Deeper Well literally just refers to looking for more for yourself. I did really enjoy the album, and I think like I do kind of agree with the sentiment of what was his name? Their name?
Chris Richards.
Mr. Richards. To be honest, what wellness album isn't kind of self-aware? Because I think that's part of the wellness album and just being like really raw about your feelings and perceptions during specific times in your life or about certain topics. I can't really think of a wellness album where that kind of misses the mark.
Seems like Mr. Richards just doesn't like the wellness aesthetic.
Solar power anti, solar
Yeah,
power
he's
anti.
anti-solar power.
With Deeper Well, like I wouldn't say this is a complete 180 to the rest of her discography, I guess. Maybe with the topics and themes, but I think a lot of her albums and the aesthetics of those albums do sort of have a focus on nature. So I wouldn't say this is like a complete 180 for her specifically, but definitely is a little bit off the beaten path for her.
The reviews that I found for Deeper Well were so on opposite ends of the spectrums. They either loved it or completely obliterated it. So I think the critics are still a little skeptical on the whole wellness girly thing.
We're mostly focusing on pop girlies. Kacey Musgraves is a country singer. So I'm thinking the girlies probably are down with this new Kacey Musgraves album, but maybe the like traditional country listeners that aren't into kind of like a witchy spirituality theme maybe are not so sure how they feel about this album.
That's two.
Because I know there's also a song on the album called The Architect, and she's like talking about like meeting the architect, and then she's like, is there even an architect? Is there a God? Is what she's asking basically. So I feel like not to like make assumptions about country listeners, but I think there's definitely a religious crossover there that maybe questioning is there a God is not really sitting right with that particular intersection of people.
Maybe partially the reason why a lot of people, especially Gen Z, detested country as a genre is because, there's a big section of it that's kind of like really into God stands, and
It's probably harder for a person that is spiritual in a religious way to connect with the more cosmos crystals kind of spirituality that exists in a lot of the folk music and like the wellness albums in particular. That could be why the wellness albums are so popular with Gen Z right now, because I feel like religion is on the decline, but spirituality is on the come up.
Major divergence from what is considered normal, especially as we're talking about it from like female musicians, causes mad controversy. I agree with you. I think like spirituality is definitely a heavy part of it. And I think people get sort of uncomfortable with musicians asking questions about things like in a existential way. Maybe people just want superficial pop music, and that's okay too. But I think both can and should exist. Should we dive into Dua Lipa?
Yes. From my understanding, I could be completely wrong about this. And also, I could have just been poisoned by like fan theories that were never anywhere close to the truth. But so obviously, Future Nostalgia kind of established her as being a disco dance music pop girly. And I remember when the music video for her single for the Barbie movie came out, the disco ball falls and everyone was like, oh my gosh, it's symbolic of her ending the disco era. I don't know if it was her or her marketing team, or again, maybe I was just poisoned by fan theories, but there was talk of her switching up her sound on her next project. The singles released from Radical Optimism so far are just continuing that disco era, which is fine. But then I'm also confused about the album cover because maybe I'm reading into it too much, but it's her swimming in the ocean next to a shark. It's bright, it's colorful, nature's at the forefront. It's the perfect wellness album aesthetic. And because of that, people online have been joking about her being in her solar power era. But I'm really only getting that wellness vibe from the cover art, not so much from the music videos or performances. Aside from her wearing a starfish necklace in the training season music video.
No, I mean that's fair because I feel like the it definitely raises questions. Like this is a very interesting album cover. If I learned anything from 10th grade English is that water in art signifies some sort of like
Healing.
healing, yeah. But also the shark.
No, that does make sense though, because then it's like radical optimism. She's in the ocean and just like being optimistic that that shark is not going to eat me right now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. The context of the songs are kind of like there's a situation that could go one of two ways. With Houdini, it's like date me or you don't. But you got to make that decision. And then with Trading Season, obviously, it's more focused on like, will this be a good relationship or will I kind of be sucked into the same kind of role I've been playing in past relationships? So there's kind of like a possibility in both songs. And maybe with Radical Optimism, it's her taking the high road hoping that things will turn out for the good for her. This is just us with the stigma around sharks. You know, that was our implicit bias.
You've got Jaws trauma.
Like, that's honestly, yeah, because Jaws did a quite the number.
Dua Lipa is doing PR crisis management for sharks. Has the wellness album concept just like ruined my brain to seeing visuals of the ocean? I'm like, it's healing, it's nature. It's a wellness album. No, girl, maybe they're just taking a photo in the ocean. Maybe it's not that deep. I feel like that was common in the early 2000s to have these like beachy looking visuals for your album cover.
She did post on Instagram other like stills from that photo shoot for the album. She said something like, you have to be deep in the water to find yourself. So I guess it is her like introspective wellness album. I don't know, maybe because she is like the disco girly, it's gonna have elements of that, but also be a little more like personal for her brand.
Maybe she'll end up blending the hedonistic party and wellness aesthetics together.
Maybe they should have added like sequins to the shark and people would some little a bejeweled shark and people be like, oh yeah.
Like glittery water.
The wellness album trend is still relatively new, so I guess this could just be an example of her reinventing what that means.
Or maybe she's not even there yet.
Maybe this is just her beach filler episode. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Or maybe she just wanted to take photos at the beach. Like at the end of the day, if Dua Lipa has no fans, I'm dead. So don't worry about it.
No, yeah.
If Dua Lipa has no fans, every member of Community Vertigo is dead.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So, needless to say, we look forward to listening to Radical Optimism,
Yeah.
whether it turns out to be a wellness album or not. Did you guys want to talk about Miley Cyrus, Endless Summer Vacation?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, oh my God. This like focus on the sun is another good example of this sort of wellness album aesthetic that was spearheaded by Solar Power. Flowers is very addicting. Like, I can stop singing that song. I mean, she's kind of been in her wellness era for like a few years.
She's been around so long. She's had multiple, I feel like.
Yeah,
She always has the capacity to be in her wellness era.
she's embodied it.
She's also a good example of like country influence because that's always been a big thing for her. She always weaves it into her work somehow. When Dolly's your godmother, I mean, hello. How should we wrap this up? I'm trying to think of a question.
What's your favorite wellness album song?
I like We Can't Be Friends a lot. I've been listening to that song nonstop.
I don't know if I have a favorite song, but I will say one person that we didn't get to talk about, and that's okay because I didn't have too much to add. But when Madonna went through her wellness era and she was in her country era, that was a serve with songs like Don't Tell Me, where she was dressed as a cowgirl and doing her little dancey dance. She ate that up.
What about you?
I mean, literally anything off of Solar Power. Me sitting here in my Solar Power shirt.
Yup.
I love Fallen Fruit and Oceanic Feeling off of Solar Power and Stoned at the Nail Salon.
Me too.
That was a song that I listened to like over and over and over and over again. And I also really love California.
Fallen Fruit is so good.
The visuals for that are so beautiful too. All of the music videos that she did are so incredible.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks for watching.
Thanks, guys.
Listen to all the albums that we just talked about at the beach.
Go touch grass.